it's not that I want to change their mind necessarily to think what I think. It's that I want them to understand that they don't know everything.
Yeah.
And also to not, to not vilify people. Like that's a big part of what makes me
Yeah,
mad about these
totally.
people, is that they're vilifying the people that they claim to defend, and they don't realize it. It's like you think that you're on the side of the marginalized and oppressed, and you're hurting the marginalized and oppressed, and you're
Yeah.
vilifying the marginalized and oppressed, and you're actually erasing them.
Yeah,
You're erasing them from the conversation.
totally.
And of course you covered that in your book, and I was listening to your interview with Bridget recently, and you guys talk about that. And she said something like, they've almost become invisible, the actual, the immigrants, the working class, the like poor people of color, the POCs, they've been invisibilized by these people who think that they're highlighting racial injustice.
100%. I mean, 100%. And I mean, in my analysis, like they are using race and gender to avoid talking about the ways in which overeducated liberal elites have actually benefited from income inequality. So they use this other topic. They're like, this is the real inequality, when the real inequality is like, no, the real inequality is you're making a collective income between you and your husband of $400,000 a year, and you act like you're living paycheck to paycheck, right? That's the real inequality. It's not racial, and it's not about gender. And because it's a big distraction mechanism, right? Any people of color who speak up and say, actually, like, we're not on the same, this is what we actually want, that really just gets in the way of what is a big elaborate, I don't want to say ruse, because I think a lot of people do it just like you said, unconsciously. Like they don't realize that they're doing it. They really believe that like they're pushing, the arc of justice, the arc of the universe towards justice. But what they're doing is distracting from the ways that they're benefiting from income inequality. And if anybody from a minority community, from marginalized communities speaks up, that can only get in the way of their true aim. And, we know from the data, that, starting in 2015, white liberals became more extreme in their views on race than blacks and Hispanics. So their views on race became woke. And meanwhile, Black and Hispanic Americans stayed normal, right? Like
Mm.
we could see this in poll after poll. We know that the media right now, elite media, is catering only to the top 10%. They only want the top 6% of who call themselves progressives to be reading their papers, which is why the news has gotten so terrible and so woke. Not about politics, it's about class. It always comes down to that. And I think something really important is what my next book is about, is like it's not just like the bottom that's invisible. 70% of Americans are working class and middle class, and we never ever hear from them. The Democrats have become a coalition of the super rich, overeducated top 10%, and then the super poor who rely on government subsidies. And there's nothing left in the Democratic platform for the middle class and the working class in the middle, who don't want handouts. They don't want to live on the generosity of rich libs. They want jobs that give them dignity so they can support themselves and their family and have a fair shot at the American dream. I hear that from Black Americans who are working class, Hispanic Americans who are working class, white Americans who are working class. They're not polarized. They're not politically divided. They don't care about any of that stuff. Like, that whole polarization is an elite phenomenon, again, to distract us from the fact that there is a huhuge class divide. I'm ranting. I don't know why. I forgot what the question was. I got
No,
off on one of
I don't
my
remember either, but I know. You're right, and it's so important that you say these things, because it doesn't appear to be being talked about in the
yeah.
media. And what you said about these people who are making, $400,000 a year between the two of them, and I think, this has always been the problem I've had with class, because when I was a kid, or when I was in high school, I had such a big chip on my shoulder about class and what my family made and had versus what my friends' families made and had, because I think they didn't understand. Like, I find that a big problem with middle or upper middle class people is that they don't realize that everyone's not like them. Like, they really don't understand what it's like to not have money and financial security. Like, they seem to be able to sort of talk about marginalization and oppression and all of these ideas, but in reality they don't get it. I mean, again, because they're really not around people who are like that, but they couldn't imagine, this is, I don't know, probably an imperfect example, but I would always get mad because when I would be like, oh, I can't do that, I'm broke, it actually meant I literally didn't have any money in my bank account. Whereas some of my friends would say, like, oh, I can't do that, I'm broke, but they have like an inheritance, or they have like, like $50,000 in a savings account. Like, it's like when they say they're broke, it means a totally different thing than when working class or poor people say they're broke. And
Yeah.
I don't know if that computes.
No, it totally doesn't compute. And I think another thing is like, they don't understand like the central value in working class life, which is autonomy. Like working class people are deeply committed to a sense of autonomy. Like that what they have, they got by the fruit of their labor, through the dignity of working for it. They don't want something from somebody else, and they want that labor to pay off. And I feel that the upper middle class that we're talking about here, the top 10% who go to these fancy schools and then get these jobs in like professional or managerial roles, these people have never actually really had to work like that for
Yeah.
what they have. A lot of it has been given to them. I'm not saying they didn't study hard for tests or whatever, but that's really the extent of it, right? Like, it's like that's the extent of it. They really have. We're in this situation where there's not a lot of upward mobility anymore, which means that the top 10% is reproducing itself in its children, but like really nobody else is sort of getting up there anymore. We've become one of the most backward nations of the developed world when it comes to upward mobility. And like that's a real problem. And that's really what the book sort of tells from one corner, from the journalism corner, right? So journalism used to be this like scrappy working class trade, like this low status job. And the kind of person who became a journalist was like somebody probably like you, like someone kind of like smart, but also like suspicious of authority, like quick-witted, maybe a little bit of a smart aleck, like someone who like would sit in the back of the classroom and like crack wise and get kicked out of class and like
Right.
question the teacher's authority. And like, at the time, I mean, it was men, right? But so the rest of the class would go to the factory, right? To join the factory line. But this guy was so anti-authority, he would have been a danger, if he had gone to the factory. He couldn't get the factory job. So he'd become a journalist, and he'd do the same thing. He would see himself as like constantly, my job is to question authority. You're a person in power and you tell me something, I say, who says? Who gave you power over me? Because he saw himself as responsible to the guy in the line, right? And at the factory, right? That's who he saw himself as answerable to. Today, the kind of person who becomes a journalist is the kid sitting in the front row of that classroom. And every time the teacher asks a question, me, and the teacher has to pretend that they don't see them so they can give someone else a chance. Like these people are
Right.
so into authority. They never break any rules. They never get kicked out of class. They got straight A's and they went on to some, fancy university. We know that like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, NPR, these places that are supposed to be progressive, they take their interns from the top 1% of universities, right? So it's this kid is the kid who's becoming the journalist, and they hate questioning authority, right? Like they've never met an authority figure that they didn't feel deserved their respect, right? So instead of seeing their role as like questioning authority on behalf of the little guy, they are now have class solidarity with the people in power. And that explains everything about what you read in the New York Times and the Washington Post and what you hear on NPR, like why this stuff is now like totally unreadable, unwatchable. CNN, MSNBC, it's all for that kid in the front row, who like went to that's the mentality there. Like they've closed themselves off into like a kind of caste almost. And everybody else is exactly like you said, wrong or stupid and not worthy of persuasion.